Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Bredos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. The historical reality of 400 years of American church history is that white American Protestants in both the North and South repeatedly used their theology and churches to perpetuate racial power imbalances in the name of Jesus Christ. From Jonathan Edwards' slaveholding to Billy Graham's support for President Nixon's racially charged law and order policies, participation in racial oppression scandalized the legacies of many of the most gifted preachers and theologians in the white evangelical church. Racism has never gone away. It adapted. Most white Christians can be described as complicit in racism. Has the sin of racism been so pervasive among white evangelicals that it requires collective repentance? To dialogue on that question and many others, we have on the Radical Imagination today two of America's most prominent preachers, scholars, and activists. Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove is a celebrated spiritual writer, preacher, and activist on the steering committee of the Poor People's Campaign. He's co-authored with Reverend William Barber, The Third Reconstruction, Moral Mondays, Fusion Politics, and the Rise of a New Justice Movement. His most recent book is The Revolution of Values, Reclaiming Public Faith for the Common Good. He lives with his family at the Ruta House, a Christian community and house of hospitality in Durham, North Carolina, where he directs the school for conversion. I'm blessed to have his friendship. He's become an indispensable co-host on several of our recent shows. Jemar Tisby is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Color of Compromise, and its follow-up, How to Fight Racism, Courageous Christianity and the Journey Toward Racial Justice. He's the president of The Witness, a faith-based Black Christian collective dedicated to exploring race, religion, politics, and culture in modern U.S. history. Jemar has graduate training in both American history and Reformed Christian theology, is actively organizing people around the framework of the arc of racial justice, awareness, relationships, commitment, a clear model of how to think and act about race in productive ways. So welcome. I'm so blessed. Let me use that term. I am not of Protestant, but I am consider myself a strong spiritual progressive, culturally Jewish. But I am blessed. I'm blessed to have you both here.
And you are a blessing.
You are a blessing.
And a blessing.
All right, blessing to us all, and let's get started. This is fascinating work, and both of you. Let me start it off with this in this way. How does both your work and activism come together? You both have similar interests here in the church. You both had experiences in those institutions. Tell our audience how you relate to each other's work. Let me put it that way at this point.
Well, let me just jump in and say what a privilege it is to be on with Brother Jemar. Jemar is, in addition to being, the New York Times best-selling author that you introduced him as, yes. He is indeed just a brother who's doing some of the most important organizing on the church side of these complex social issues that we're all dealing with in this country. And whether you're part of the church or not, you should pay attention to what Jemar is doing. It is a blessing to the country. So I'm so glad to be on with him. So let me just say, I interact with your work, my brother, in a sense of always being grateful for it and always grateful to be with you. So yeah, please do jump in and let folks know a little bit of the story of how you came to the work you're doing.
Absolutely. Well, it's great to be on with you again, Jonathan. Great to be on the Radical Imagination. Thank you so much for having me. You asked how our work intersects, and I think biographically, believe it or not, Jonathan and I share some things in the sense that we learned a lot of Christianity initially through white evangelical churches and circles. And so folks may be surprised to hear that, because if you're watching this and you realize that I'm Black, and how did you get introduced to Christianity in a white evangelical setting? Well, one of the things we have to realize is the sort of results of the evangelical racial reconciliation movement um, has been the entrance of more Black people and people of color into predominantly and historically white evangelical spaces. Now, we came with the good faith that, we were attempting to live out what the Bible tells us in Revelation 5:9 and 7:9 about people of every tribe and tongue and nation gathering together to worship the throne. And then we said, well, if we pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, then we need to move toward these interracial, multi-ethnic spaces right now and not just wait for the sweet by and by. Well, we get into those spaces, and in many cases, we were in for a rude awakening. So I come to this place and to Jonathan's work as a fellow sojourner who gained a lot from these white evangelical spaces, deep friendships and relationships, an authentic conversion, but at the same time, one who has been made aware, often jarringly so, of the failures of the church, in particular when it comes to issues of justice broadly, but more specifically, racial justice. And so I'm always on the lookout for other sojourners on this journey, and found Jonathan's work in his books as a voice that was deeply reflective, someone who's coming from within these circles and not simply speaking as an outsider, but also as one who is a practitioner and deeply committed to living out justice and equity in his own life. And so I've just been privileged to cross paths with him.
Uh-huh.
Well, we are in the midst of a reckoning. I mean, democracy is having a reckoning. America and its role in the world is having a reckoning, and Christianity is having a reckoning in the midst of that. And one of the things that I often tell people in terms of my own journey is that I grew up in the place where plantation capitalism was born. I mean, if you just trace this story, I mean, we've had like the 1619 Project that's looked at the last 400 years, and that, if you begin at Jamestown telling that story. But if you look at, Eastern Virginia, Eastern North Carolina, Northern South Carolina, that land, and literally the fertile land that the rivers that run down to the ocean there created, that is the place where folks hashed out in the colonial era many of the patterns of life that we've continued to practice. Race-based chattel slavery was born there, and with it, the race as we understand it now was born, and all of that in the context of Christian faith. People reasoning and making sense of that, making sense of the exploitation of other people, the stealing of land, and the use and abuse of other people's bodies, all in the context of faith. So my own journey has been one of, as someone who was raised up in that faith, and who, my relationship with God through Jesus Christ is very important to me. But as I began to realize how twisted that whole tradition had been, and the way it had hurt not only so many people who were used and abused by that system, but even how it had hurt my people, people who thought that they were benefiting from this system, and yet it had taken away from us the heart of our faith itself. And so my own journey has been one of trying to name what was actually slaveholder religion and not the faith of Jesus, and to find in a faith that I can practice and learn from others, a real way towards freedom, a way towards justice, and the thing that I just wanted to let people know is that Brother Jemar here, particularly with his historical work in Color of Compromise, has done some of that incredibly important work of reaching back in this story, all 400 years of it, and saying, what were Black folks hearing in the scriptures? What were they singing when they were worshiping? What was their worship about, and how can we all learn from that in terms of finding a faith that is good news for everybody, the people who practice it and neighbors of other faiths or of no particular faith at all. So I think that's an incredibly important contribution in this day and time, to not only have that historical perspective, but also to be, actively building culture with other people around those resources. So needed in this moment.
I wonder if you bear witness to my own journey here for a minute.
Please.
Actually, as you
How did our Jewish brother from New York City get interested in these questions?
Guess what? I forgot to just tell you guys, because this just happened a couple weeks ago. The psychiatrist James Gilligan and Bandy Lee, psychiatrist Dr. Bandy Lee, who edited the book The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, and I had our proposal accepted to Union Theological Seminary. And our proposal is to start an institute for the prevention of violence, bringing about the blessed community. So this Jewish boy from New York City will be part of Union. I'm proudly part of Union Theological Seminary. But I have to tell you guys, and then I'll throw it back to you. As an 8-9-year-old kid growing up in Denver, I remember listening to Billy Graham in my best friend's house on a Sunday evening. And I was a naive little kid there. I had been, family moved from New York to Denver, and I was pretty much a fish out of water there. Anyway, listening to Billy Graham talk about how you don't accept Christ as your savior, you're all going to go to hell and burn, and that included Jews and everybody else. And as a little 8-year-old kid, I said, man, this was nuts. This guy, there's something really wrong with this guy. And what he was preaching. So, all right. So let me just say that too. I want very much to understand where that comes from. And if I may, just for 1 minute, because Jonathan knows we had a wonderful show with Susanna Heschel, who's done a historical study of the German Protestant theologians and their influence on Hitler, the Aryan Jesus. So let me just throw that out to you and get your response to that, and how it relates again to your concerns within the American.
Thank you for sharing your personal story. I mean, it's one that my people certainly need to hear, because what I will say from lots of long relationships with people I know, that I understand the basic evangelical impulse to be that people who have had an experience that they feel has been transformative and good for them want to share it with someone else, and usually do that within a framework and through a lens that doesn't at all consider where somebody else is coming from. So the little Jewish boy sitting in Denver, nobody is necessarily listening to your story, to what it sounds like to you, to hear this message, and certainly not thinking about the way that in the name of spreading good news, we sure have done a whole lot of harm in the world. So that's the kind of critical work that both Jemar and I try to do within our community, to talk about what evil has been done in the name of good. Because, I mean, you certainly know this if you're working on a project to address violence and to take religion seriously is that much of the violence in the history of the world and much of the violence in the world today is done by people who believe they're serving God's cause and doing what is not only good but righteous. And so,
in the name of religion.
in the name of religion, indeed, yes.
So help us understand that, Jemar, and how we can heal ourselves from that. As you're trying to do here.
Bringing up Billy Graham is important. I mean, he died at the age of 99 just a couple of years ago, and really for half a century was literally the face of white evangelicalism in the United States, and also exported that globally as he did his international crusades. And if you think of it, before we get to theology and ideology, here's a tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed North Carolinian, this sort of picture in the mid-20th century of the all-American preacher, right? Which in and of itself tells you what stories are being highlighted and elevated. And then you get into what Graham actually believed. One of the reasons why he's so celebrated by so many is because he focused on, quote unquote, just preaching the gospel, right? So he was known as an evangelist, wasn't even a local church pastor. He's a guy who goes out and makes it his life mission to tell other people about Jesus, which there's a strong impulse of that in the New Testament, although it's probably been highlighted to the exclusion of the rest of what the New Testament teaches. Nevertheless, that focus, it has seemed to many to be relatively innocuous, non-threatening. He's just telling people about Jesus, but imported within that message are all kinds of other messages about who belongs, who's included, who's excluded, whose rights and priorities should be at the center. So, for example, notoriously, and Graham later regretted this himself, he's in the Oval Office with multiple presidents throughout his ministry, but the only one he decides to endorse is Richard Nixon, who is his good friend, actually. I mean, they go golfing together, they hang out together. And then, of course, Nixon, as was alluded to in the intro, is using law and order politics, which is a racially coded message. That means cracking down on Black people and poor people in inner cities because they have the audacity to protest against their own marginalization and exclusion. So it's those kinds of things. He was very anti-communist and very vocally anti-communist, which was a stance that was also turned against civil rights activists. There's a sign, you can Google it on the internet, and it says race mixing is communism. And so they were equating the racial justice and civil rights efforts in the United States with communism, lumping it in with the Red Scare and all of that. And this is being promulgated by men like Billy Graham, and that's just at the highest level. So you can imagine what's actually happening at the local church level with local pastors and people in the pew. So we do have to take a critical eye to say, well, it's not just as straightforward as telling people about Jesus. It's coming loaded with all this social, cultural, historical baggage that we at least need to be aware of as we talk about these things.
Is that what you mean when you talk about the complicity here? And let's not mince words here. Nixon was well known to be an anti-Semite and a racist individual. I mean, Graham is a sophisticated individual. I mean, did he not know anything about it? Did he just, in denial, or what's that about? What about his own training in his own divinity school? And where did he get this stuff? And the big money that's behind evangelical, these Christians, evangelical preachers as well. I know I threw out a lot there, but
when I had to face the question of how had this long history of white supremacy twisted our faith, I started thinking about it in terms of a different kind of faith emerging. Frederick Douglass called it slaveholder religion. And that's the name I've stuck with. He said, Frederick Douglass was a Christian, but he was raised by people who called themselves Christian and claimed to own him. And he said, I prayed for my freedom for 20 years and, God never answered my prayers until I prayed with my feet. He ran away. When he got away, he found the AME church, and he found in that context a different way of understanding the Christian faith. So he said, between the Christianity of the slaveholder and the Christianity of Christ, I see the widest possible difference. So, on my side of things, of course, I didn't have that same kind of break in terms of understanding that literally had to run away in order for my body to be free. But I began to try to use the distinction that he had made to understand what was it that was passed down to me that is true and good, and what is really poisonous, not just to me, but to the world. And so as I looked closely at slaveholder religion and tried to understand how it had been perpetuated in another era, for example, as we've been talking about through the ministry of someone like Billy Graham, it became clear to me that from the end of the Civil War, there were two strands. On the one hand, there were those who were energized by their faith to start explicitly white supremacist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, right? So the symbol of the Klan is a fiery cross. I mean, these are intentionally Christian symbols where people are going to use the faith in order to try to reassert their white supremacy. That comes all the way down to the present. I mean, we saw it right at the Capitol riot on January 6th. So that's still with us. But that in the whole spectrum of slaveholder religion, that has always been something of a minority movement. The great majority of white folks who again received this sort of distorted, twisted slaveholder religion that passes Christianity, what they reasoned that the way to follow Jesus in a world, that is controlled by folks who claim to own other people, by an economic system that is willing to accept a certain amount of death and abuse, just in order to have what we call the goods of the system. In the midst of all that, they reasoned that there is a world out there that is what it is and that you have to accept, and that the gospel is about this narrower section of things. Usually it's about the individual and their decision to follow Jesus, and it's probably about how they treat their family and the people close to them. Love your neighbor as you love yourself is about whether you take cookies by when somebody moves into the house next door. It gets very narrowed down and confined to a social sphere where people can make sense of it. And so then someone like Billy Graham can preach what he says is just the gospel, which is about that very narrow experience of individuals. And individuals can make personal choices that may well change, the way they treat folks at home or even the way they think about themselves, but is not any longer concerned about the systems of the world and how they work. And so in order to grow the ministry, in order to have a bigger influence, someone like Billy Graham can get right there in with the political powers, with the economic powers that are literally chewing people up. And the gospel that they preach has nothing to say to challenge that because it's already been so narrowed. So I think that's the side of slaveholder religion that I'm often wrestling with and trying to understand, how is that still with us? Because there are a whole lot of Christian ministries today that are happy to go along with a lot of the nonsense that we see in this world and stuff that is hurting real people. Right. Go along with it because it seems like it will benefit and grow the ministry. If the ministry is simply understood as this sort of narrow definition of the capacity to tell other people about something that they can individually affirm and that only touches their individual lives.
So as you and Reverend Barber put it, the Bible in a sense has been hijacked. And what's so beautiful, one of the many beautiful things about your work, Jemar, is that you get us to forget about that hypocrisy and talk about the connection between politics and morality as we try to save our souls and save our civic life as well, if you will.
You're right. So
found on that. Yeah.
So to build off what Jonathan was saying, the individualism is really a big issue, and it also touches on complicity. So, as a sociologist, you know this. Westerners in general, we're highly individualistic, but then Michael Emerson and Christian Smith's cornerstone work, really, in Divided by Faith, also demonstrates that white evangelicals in particular are even more individualistic than the general population. And the way that affects their understanding of social issues in general and race in particular is they define the problem of racism as interpersonal attitudes and prejudices towards someone else. So that means, using the N-word, barring Black people from your store or whatever it might be. And if that's the problem, then the solution is equally individualistic. Well, I don't use the N-words, and some of my best friends are Black, and I try to treat all people the same. I don't see color, right? And that makes sense within their theological cultural toolkit, which is already highly individualistic. What's harder to see are the systemic, societal, institutional ways that injustices get embedded without any individual in particular intentionally trying to enact racism. And so it's in the ways the systems and laws are constructed. You can look at today and think of stand your ground laws, right? It ostensibly race neutral and colorblind, but the ways those laws get applied in different cases, and we can go on and on and on. There's the famous example Michelle Alexander brought out in her book, The New Jim Crow, about the disparities in sentencing between cocaine in the rock form or crack and cocaine in the powder form, right? You can go on and on and on. And I'm talking about contemporary examples because a lot of the argument people try to make as they're pushing back against my work is that, oh, that was in the past. We've moved beyond that. That may have been true in the 1960s or the 1860s, but here we are in the 21st century, and we had a Black president, right? And again, a very individualistic view where if you look at the advancement and forms of success that one Black person or small group of Black people have, that is used as evidence that none of this applies anymore. And then the last thing I'll say is about complicity. Most people, when they think of racists, think of the most egregious examples. They think of the people who tie the noose, who plant the dynamite, who burn the crosses. Well, none of that could have happened without a large group of white Christians remaining silent and turning a blind eye toward those extreme behaviors. So that's what I'm trying to sort of grab the U.S. church by the lapels and shake and say, can't you see that silence and apathy is supporting an unjust status quo? And if you say you are for racial equality, if you say you are for racial justice, then you actually have to say it and do it, and not just individually believe it without taking action. Otherwise, that could be a form of complicity.
That's a critical piece. Yeah. Can I just say one thing? Because this is a battle we're very much in the midst of. And what you're naming as this propensity to believe that my personal choices, my individual actions, and my wanting the best for every person, no matter the color of their skin, whatever, however you say that propensity among evangelicals makes the evangelical community particularly susceptible to the backlash against racial justice that we're seeing right now, which is all these mostly politicians, but others too, who are motivated by the same kinds of power struggles, who are coming along and saying that there's this dangerous thing called critical race theory. They haven't read any of it, but it's very dangerous. And what they characterize it as a movement that says white people are inherently racist. And so to exactly the mindset we've been talking about, any white evangelical who's grown up and lives in this world where, Jesus loves everybody just the same. And, the Jesus who's in my heart tells me that I ought not have ought against anybody, certainly not based on the color of their skin. They hear that that's what this critical race theory is, and they said, "Oh, that's terrible. That must be racist." So now the attempt to name how racism has shaped our society is, in their mind, just this thing that is itself a sort of racism. And so they're so susceptible to these lies that are being told. When, as a matter of fact, whatever you call a systemic analysis, a basic systemic analysis says, look at the world around us. We are, 50 years removed from the civil rights movement, and on every major social indicator, the racial disparities persist. We just have been coming through COVID for the last year and a half. If you're Black in America, you're twice as likely to die from COVID as a white person. But you can go down the whole list. It's education disparity, it's health disparities, it's wealth disparities, it's income disparities. All of those things persist. And so what the white Christian has to face is, at some point, is either you believe that those disparities persist because there is some basic difference between white and Black people, and Black people just don't do as well in this world, or there is some kind of systemic injustice that is disproportionately hurting folks with dark skin in a country that for hundreds of years called people with dark skin chattel property. And once you've said that, then I think you have to say about the gospel that the gospel, which is good news for all people, peace on earth, goodwill toward all people, that good news has to have something to say about that. And I think that's the work that Jemar and you are trying to do today, is to say to the church, what role does the church play in working for justice in the world if the gospel is to be good news for all people?
Right. And so let's talk a little about voter suppression and also reparations, because again, along your line of thinking, Jonathan, white evangelicals will say, well, listen, I'm not a slaveholder anymore, or I'm not, and I'm not going to, why should I be giving reparations to people who are no longer slaves? So they very personalize it when they, again, don't see the structural nature of it and how the institutions that they belong to are perpetuating that inequality. So how do you get beyond that, those distortions, those denials, and through your work in establishing this framework of the ark, in getting people to see that it's more than just relationships, that's important, but commitment to the social change, the policies. And of course, that's what Reverend Barber and Johnson are working on too. Policies have to be there as well.
So I'm going to give a response to a question I get very frequently is essentially, how do you talk to racists?
Yeah.
Or how do you talk to racial justice resistors? The people who are in some way, shape, or form more vociferously or more subtly opposed to the kinds of work that Jonathan and I and all of us do. On one level, I am not persuaded that we should prioritize persuading prejudiced people more than living out the justice that we say we support. I say that because in my own work with The Witness, for instance, we began as an organization that sort of wanted to make room at the Reformed and white evangelical table, so to speak, and sort of just tentatively raise our hands and say, hey, we're here too, and we got stuff to say. Well, it very quickly became apparent that if you wanted a seat at those tables, one, they were never built with us in mind, and two, if you would have a seat, then you had to, in many ways, leave your color and your culture at the door, and that was a price that we weren't willing to pay, quite honestly. And then two, we were spending so much time and energy trying to convince folks who the Bible would call hard-hearted. I'm reminded of the prayer in the Old Testament, replace their hearts of stone with hearts of flesh, right? I'm reminded in Mark chapter 6, where Jesus says, sends the disciples out 2 by 2, says, if they won't receive you, kick the dust off your sandals and move on to the next village. And it's not giving up on people, so to speak. It's letting people have the agency on their own to say they believe something and they're not ready to hear anything different. And in the meantime, we've got other work to do. So that's one level. But let me get real practical for folks, because there are situations where family members, friends, coworkers, even spouses, you can't avoid, these folks in your life. So then what do you do? All right, let me give you three things. One, start with your personal journey, your personal witness, if you will. For all of us, there was something in our lives that made us care about racial justice and about our neighbors on a social and political level. What was that for you? Trace that. And it may not be one thing, but figure that out and figure out how to tell that story concisely and compellingly. So sharing yours, because it's a little bit harder to just shut down if you have a relationship with someone and they're just telling you about their experience. Step two, from there, if it's a Christian, go to the Bible, because I'm far from convinced that Christians know how to apply the Bible's teachings when it comes to issues of race and justice. I'm far from convinced that even Christian folk know what the Bible says about interacting with different people groups and about the beauty of diversity and all of these things. So go to the Bible, get really good. You don't have to master every single passage. Get really good at a few different passages that illustrate the beauty of diversity, the imperative of justice, and all of those things. And then step three, then you can go on to some of the other work. Give them Jonathan's book, give them my book, talk about the history. I found, as much as people want to push back against it, they don't argue about the historical record. Like, that's clear. We've got primary sources from the Mississippi Articles of Secession, for instance, that say our cause is thoroughly identified with slavery, the greatest material interest on the earth. And so if you want to say something like the Civil War is not about slavery, well, don't listen to me. You can listen to the folks who seceded, right? So things like that are helpful, and then other outside resources are helpful, but you can't really start there for people who have been intellectually inoculated against these facts that would mitigate against their accepted beliefs and practices.
And let me just say, with regard to your first bit of wisdom about shaking the dust off and doing what you got to do, there's a long history of that I'm always encouraging white folks who begin to take justice seriously to pay attention to. The Mother Bethel AME Church, those were folks who were trying to worship Jesus with other folks who said they were worshiping Jesus, but their whiteness was getting in the way of understanding them to be in full fellowship with Black folks. So we talk about this often in terms of the Black church tradition, but I always say, look, go back and pay attention to what those folks were saying. At the Mother Bethel, at the Abyssinia Baptist Church, at any of these churches that began when folks were not able to fully participate in churches that couldn't see their whiteness. And in those contexts, almost to a person in the record, they said, we want to be a church for everybody. So we do have a history in the United States of a church for everybody. And that church has always been a church that has said to follow Jesus is to work for justice. Those churches, they're not just Black churches. Those are churches that can teach all people who want to be church what it means to see justice as essential to the discipleship and the church life of people who are on this way. So I think there's a whole lot that can be learned just by paying attention to that history, which is why I love folks like Jemar, who are historians, teaching people this history. It's incredibly important.
Let me ask you also, the history, and I'm asking this because I don't know the answer. I am naive about this. How much are the Hebrew scriptures brought into your analysis, your studies, where the the goal is to love the other as yourself, and the stranger, for you are a stranger in a strange land. How much does that resonate with your work? Some of that prophetic tradition.
Oh yeah.
Resonates incredibly with my work, and honestly, I need to dive more. I need to do a running jump head first dive into the Hebrew scriptures of the Old Testament to plumb the depths even more. I'll say this to Jonathan's point about the historic Black church, and really it has always been incredibly sort of illogically, from an earthly standpoint, welcoming to all kinds of folks, even white folks, even to the point where folks in South Carolina welcomed a white supremacist into their Bible study, even though he would later murder them. It's always been that kind of welcoming environment. Which talked about the Hebrew scriptures. Well, it's really interesting that when you look at the Black church tradition, and I'm speaking in general terms here because, of course, the Black church tradition is varied and diverse, but in general, when you compare the Black church tradition to white and white evangelical church traditions as they developed in the United States, you'll find sort of different theological starting points, where white Christians and white evangelicals tend to start in the New Testament with the Gospels or even the epistles with the resurrection and the triumph of Christ in the resurrection. Black folks tend to start with the Exodus. They tend to start in the Old Testament with slavery in Egypt and a God who delivers them from literal physical bondage, and find identification with the people of Israel in the Old Testament. And then look at the richness of the scriptures to speak to issues of justice in the corporate and communal sense, and not just in terms of individual piety. So as we look at how these Christian traditions developed, they take as sort of iconic places in the Bible. They're starting at different points, and that leads to a very different ethic when it comes to things like racial and social justice.
Yeah, and on the question of how those texts get read, I mean, it's important to say, white evangelicals, call it the Old Testament, but read it all. Read the prophets, read the Psalms, read all of these texts, and yet this triumphalism that Jemar is pointing towards is often used to kind of take pretty narrow readings of parts of that text that were written by people who were marginalized, oppressed, pushed to the very edge, and who saw the power of God to sustain them as something to celebrate. We'll take those same texts and use that sort of victory song to back up some kind of American triumphalism and say that, that our faith calls us to bless the largest empire in the world.
Yeah.
It's an incredible distortion, but it is reading the same text.
Yeah.
And so I think what we have to pay attention to is the way that a community always shapes how you read a text. And so many of our communities have been so walled off from people who read the same text in a different way that it never even occurs to them that the very words could mean something else, because they've never read the scriptures from essentially from below. They've never read it with people who have shared that experience of being marginalized and ostracized by the powers in their society. But man, once you take a step back and have an opportunity to read it in that way, and just a little bit of critical distance, say, now wait a second, who were these texts originally written to?
Yeah.
Oh my, they come alive in a different way. And so I think it's an incredible opportunity for white Christians whose faith has been so narrowed and so watered down. I mean, I believe faith gets exploited because it's some powerful stuff. But man, once you've had the stuff that's so watered down, if you just get a taste of that, powerful stuff that's there when you read it alongside people who share the experience of those who are in the text. It's a powerful story. Incredibly powerful.
It is. But that alternative powerful story, and this is, I'm going to quote from Chris Hedges' book, American Fascists, The Christian Right and the War on America, in which he quotes his own ethics professor at Harvard. The Christian fascists, its stated goal was to use the United States to create a global Christian empire. It was hard at the time to take such fantastic rhetoric seriously, especially given the quality of leaders of the Christian right. Now, this was again about 40 years ago he's talking about. But Adams warned against the blindness caused by intellectual snobbery. The Nazis, he said, we're not going to return with swastikas and brown shirts. Their ideological inheritors in America had found a mask for fascism and patriotism in the pages of the Bible. So isn't what you're talking about, that narrow vision. And what, Jemar, you're talking about is a liberation from that narrow narrative. And as you use, again, sort of a sociological term, differential association, Edwin Sutherland, you learn it, you can unlearn it. And that's so much of what your recent book is
That's
about.
what I'm saying.
Learn this
Listen,
stuff, right? And the work that
thank
you
you
do.
for,
Yeah.
because folks got to understand, Jonathan and I both love the church. We love people. We want to see it healthier, and we want to see it flourish, and we want to see it live up to the beautiful vision that Jesus laid out, right? And a lot of people will listen to a conversation like this or look at my work and say, well, he's just bashing white people or white evangelicals. No. I'm holding up a mirror, hopefully, and hopefully calling you and all of us to a higher standard, right? And the reason why I can do that is because I believe change is possible, as you mentioned. And I believe, to Jonathan's point about the narrowness, that most people aren't necessarily malicious in their intent. There are definitely some bad actors out there. Often they're the loudest ones leading people in a very unhealthy direction. But the people, the folks, I believe want to do right and well, but they've only been exposed to this incredibly narrow, not only socially, but historically narrow perspective of what it means to be and do religion. And what we're trying to do in so many ways is say, no, there's a much wider scope of what it means to live out your faith, right? And then what we try to do is offer some practical steps, some pathways that people can do that. That's where my book, How to Fight Racism, comes in, which it's packed with the practical, right? I just want to say that, like, if you want to know where to start, every chapter's got suggestions. But I think the most important value of the book is the arc of racial justice, that framework, which allows us to think about, how am I building awareness about these issues? How am I developing intentionally relationships across divides? How am I working on a systemic and institutional level to commit to broad-based change? What that does, it helps us develop a disposition and orientation toward racial justice, because what tends to happen now is an occasional reactive kind of racial justice. So when the next horrible headline hits the news, then people are up in arms. We got to march, we got to write, we got to talk about this, and then it goes away. And then you fall back into status quo. So the arc of racial justice helps you actually think about, how do I actually change direction in my life? Become more like folks like Jonathan, who are living this out every single day, no matter if it hits the headlines or not. And that's how we bring about change.
Right. Unfortunately,
what you're doing is so helpful, because it's just like those of us who have a sudden realization that our bodies are changing in the middle of life, and we're either not moving enough or we're eating too much, and all of a sudden we want to change. But then the patterns of life are such that the only way you're going to make lasting change, everybody has to learn this at some point, is you have to have a daily program. See, you're trying to give people a daily program for living justice. That's what Christians call discipleship. Yeah, and folk come at Jemar like he's somehow, trying to lead people astray. No, this is what it means to follow Jesus. And if that's the journey you're on, here's a brother who can help you find that way. If you're traveling on some other road and yet you got your Christians as your neighbors, be grateful for somebody like Jemar, because he's trying to help them be better neighbors than we've been.
We are so grateful for both of you, my brothers. And just we've run out of time. Unfortunately, the hours flew. But let me also say, I love the Christian churches as well. I must tell you that along with listening to Billy Graham that Sunday evening, I spent most of my childhood and young adulthood in Denver, going to Methodist churches, Unitarians, the Quakers. I didn't go to too many synagogues at all. But in any case, still don't that much, but I do attend. Listen, this has flown by. This has been just a blessing and such a beautiful dialogue. Thank you so much for your work and who you are and what you stand for. And again, thank you so very, very much.
Thank you so much. Had so much fun on this conversation.
This is wonderful. We'll carry it on. Be strong. Take care.
Take care.
Thank you so very, very much for watching us here on The Radical Imagination. This is Jim Vredos. We'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination. Wade in the water.